Thanks very much, Fergus. Can I now introduce our second panellist, Bruce Dover, who'll be known to many of you. Bruce has been involved in media for over 25 years and has been a senior executive in a number of countries with some of the world's leading media companies. He's had special experience in Asia. He's been News Corporation's first China executive, establishing China's first internet joint venture, and also headed up the Asia television operations of CNN International News Network. Bruce, some years ago, conducted the review of the ABC Asia Pacific satellite television service, and a bit over 3 years ago, in 2007, was appointed to the position of Chief Executive of Australia Network, the ABC's international television service to Asia and the Pacific. Would you please welcome Bruce?
Thank you, everybody. I was just thinking that as a journalist, how I might describe the august gathering of current and former ambassadors present here today. I was thinking of gaggle. A gaggle of ambassadors would seem to be the most appropriate, but it's a testimony, obviously, to the way in which this meeting is seen and held. Thank you, Fergus. In terms of, I guess, it is the media who have much to do with presenting those preposterous, outdated stereotypes of Indonesia and Australia. The media does bear a lot of responsibility or carry some of the blame. It's probably part of the solution. I think it's a fact that in some ways we were better served by our mainstream media 25 years ago than we are today. At that time, the mainstream media, including the main press, the Fairfax press, the then Herald and Weekly Times, carried detailed, informed opinion about what was happening under the Suharto government. Colleagues like Hamish MacDonald, who's here today, but David Jenkins, Peter Hastings, Peter Robinson, Professor Jamie Mackey from the academic side. There was informed opinion published very regularly in the mainstream press. We were equally well served by a very courageous band of Indonesian journalists at that time who pushed the boundaries of free press in Indonesia. And I, of course, refer to people like Sabam Siagian, who was at that stage the editor-in-chief of the Jakarta Post, his colleague and the Tempo co-founder, Fikri Jufri, Joseph Wanandi from the Centre for Independent Studies, and Yuli Isamatono, who is a very fearless proponent of Indonesian rights, but a very ardent judge of the Australia-Indonesia relationship. They were different times then. There was time to talk to a range of people. You could do what we called considered journalism, thumb-sucking. You could go away, talk to people, come back, think about what you wanted to say and write about it. Today's world is driven by the 24/7 news cycles of news television and the internet. There's an insatiable appetite to feed these monsters, and we shouldn't confuse reporting with good journalism, and some of that has gone away. If you look at some of the reporting there in the mainstream media from both sides, you'd be convinced that it's not President Yudhoyono or Prime Minister Gillard who are the most important people in that relationship, but Abu Bakr Bashir and Schapelle Corby. Both sides are at some fault. The way that events in Indonesia are reported in Australia and the way that events in Australia are reported back in Indonesia. As Fergus says, there is a concentration on death and disaster, terrorism, terrorists, boat people, illegal fishing, and of course the numerous drug cases. But when we focus on the capture of terrorists, we don't mention the extraordinary cooperation taking place between the AFP, the Australian Federal Police, and their Indonesian counterparts, which have done so much to bring those perpetrators to justice. Instead of concentrating on some of the benefits that are coming from the extraordinary rebuilding process going in following the tsunami, we get huge, long programs on human rights issues in Papua or ongoing events in East Timor. I'm not saying they shouldn't be covered, but there probably should be more of a balance. The ABC's Indonesian correspondent, up until about 6 months ago, Jeff Thompson, recently turned to Australia, was a very fine correspondent. He covered the tsunami events, he covered the trials in Bali, he covered the terrorism events there. But when Jeff wanted to write a positive story about what was happening in Indonesia, he was often met with resistance from his own editors back in Australia. If he couldn't link it to terrorism or Abu Bashir or to Schapelle Corby, then it wasn't going to get a run. It was difficult to justify to his own editors the need for the story to get up. Last Friday, I had lunch with a prominent Indonesian journalist, Putra Nababan, who is an anchor, deputy chief editor of one of Indonesia's most influential news programs called, I guess in English, Around Indonesia, I guess. He was down here on what is a scholarship that's funded partly by Australia Network and DFAT to do a series of stories. Before he left, he called in 4 of his most senior editors and asked them some ideas about just what it is he should be covering. They all looked at him. Didn't really have any ideas. One of them said, Schapelle Corby? And he did. He did come down here, but he was surprised by the reaction when he asked people about Schapelle Corby. He was convinced that everybody in Australia thought that Schapelle Corby had been set up by the corrupt Indonesian police, that a trial had been a travesty, and that it was all a dreadful miscarriage of justice. Instead, he found people who said how lucky she was to have been caught up in the Indonesian legal system as distinct from the Malaysian or Singaporean one, where she probably would have faced a firing squad or execution far before now. There was generally sympathy for the Indonesian experience. He went to an Indonesian school, and actually an Indonesian language school in Australia, and was surprised that there were so many young Australians taking an interest in Indonesian and wanting to travel to Indonesia to participate, to help, and to find a career there. Probably not as many as we'd like, but again, it was news to him. It's interesting, for all of the stories that Australia Network and the ABC run on terrorism, on drugs, on illegal fishing, on asylum policy, the ones that get the most response are sometimes the ones you least expect. We ran a story on Australia Network, which is broadcast into Indonesia a couple of months ago, about a young woman called Atika who had migrated to Australia. It was a 5-minute story told in her words about what it was like to be an Indonesian in Australia. And she was pretty honest. She said, it hadn't always been easy. There were pockets of racism, but overall her experience had been very positive. When she'd engaged with Australians, they'd been more than helpful. They'd become friends and they'd encouraged her, they'd helped her find work. And she talked about what it was like to be a Muslim here. As a result, we got more letters, more email from Indonesia than we had in any article before, any broadcast story before. Some of them were just surprised. They thought we were lying, that there were no mosques in Australia. Everybody knew that. They couldn't believe that an Indonesian woman could actually have come here in a short time, actually made a success of a life. But it was a very positive story and people responded to it. Likewise, a week or so ago, I think you saw the media here in which the opposition leader Tony Abbott had proposed cutting the funding going to the building of schools in Indonesia. Based on a story that appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald, we ran a story about a small school in Lombok, which had been funded under that Australian program. And it showed just a young girl talking about how it had changed her life and how at that school 2 years ago, just 4 of 50 children had gone on to high school. And 2 years later, 42 of 44 children were going on to high school. They're human stories, they're real stories, and those stories help break the mould and tell, because there's a human element to them, people find them believable. I think we've got to find more ways to tell real stories about real people in the Indonesia-Australia relationship. I mean, the great story of Indonesia in the last decade or so has been the democratisation and, if you like, the Islamicisation of Indonesia. Both have had profound effects on that society, and both of them, I think, are very far from understood in this country. Indonesia has more voices in the political debate now than many of its neighbours, more so perhaps than Singapore or Malaysia, who get none of the focus of attention that Australia gives Indonesia. It has a much more diverse and critical media than both those nations. Public opinion is being reflected through the social media there in ways that's not done in a great many other countries around the region. How do we change the perceptions of the media? It's difficult, it's long term, but I think visits like those of Putra to Australia, and by Australians, more Australian media to Indonesia, would help. They need to get beyond Bali and Jakarta and see that there's much more to the country than just those two areas. I think we should do more in terms of co-production. I think we should be trying to tell stories about Indonesians in Australia or the Australian experience in Indonesia in ways that touch people. They're positive stories, but they're real stories. I think we have to try and embrace the social media that's occurring in Indonesia. If you go to Jakarta, there's hardly a person you see anywhere that hasn't got a mobile phone to their ear. Those long commutes that occur, they've got time, they've got space, but how do we open the dialogue? How do we open a conversation with them? So I welcome any ideas you have. We welcome any pressure you might want to put on the Australian government to provide more funding. And I look forward to your ideas. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bruce. It's now my very great pleasure to ask a distinguished Indonesian and a fifth columnist for a while in Australia, Sabam Siagian, to address us. Sabam will be known, I guess, to everyone in this room. A distinguished journalistic career, which still continues, and as you know, Sabam was both a senior writer on Sinar Harapan, but also editor of the Jakarta Post for, was it 10 years, Sabam? Almost 10 years. Then the President Suharto saw fit to send the most Aussified Australian to Australia as ambassador, when we chose to send Alan Taylor, the most Javanese of Australian diplomats, to Jakarta. A very good double, I thought, at that time. Sabam has been president of the Indonesia-Australia Business Council, and much, much else. A man I've found extremely learned, both in Indonesian history and in vintages of almost every liquid.